Welcome to the New York Institute for the Humanities podcast. I'm Robert Boynton. What did you do during the COVID lockdown? While most of us were baking bread and working from home, the musician Richard Sears and the critic Adam Shatz were producing a new podcast, Myself with Others. Shatz is a critic and essayist based in Brooklyn. He is the U.S. editor of the London Review of Books and a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. Sears is a pianist and composer who splits his time between Brooklyn and Paris. He has performed with Ravi Coltrane, Joshua Redman, and many other artists. In addition to this podcast, he's working on an audio documentary about the life of Albert Tootie Heath. In Myself with Others, Shatz talks with musicians, novelists, and writers. He and Sears allowed us to run 3 episodes, which you'll be able to listen to in the coming weeks. For this week's podcast, I talk with Richard and Adam about how the project came to fruition. Richard Sears and Adam Shatz, welcome to the podcast. Richard, the project was your brainchild. How did you come up with the idea for it, and how did you and Adam meet?
I was first introduced to Adam's work through the New York Review of Books. I remember he wrote this incredible obituary for Cecil Taylor. I have sometimes joked with some friends that if you're an artist who's already won a MacArthur Genius or Pulitzer, the final prize waiting for you at the end is an obituary by Shatz. He has this unique sort of spread of interests that run across music and politics, and it turns out even cooking too. I initially approached him with this idea, thinking that it would be so cool to have a conversation, like these incredible conversations he's been publishing on the London Review of Books, but to expand that focus to include some of the musicians that I knew he was very interested in and that I was very interested in as well. So it started there.
Have you worked in podcasting before? You're a musician by training. How did this project relate to your life as a musician?
I'm a new producer. This is the first thing I've really produced. I've been playing piano my entire life with a focus on jazz, with an interest in classical piano as well. With the pandemic and without any opportunities to perform or really rehearse with other people, I was really interested in finding a way to stay engaged with music, with the arts, in a time when that kind of engagement seems so limited. For me, this is a form of practice. In some ways, doing this project has opened access to people I deeply admire, and being there for the conversations is challenging my own ideas about what music should be, what music can be. It's a way of being deeply engaged with creation, improvisation, and thinking about the art.
So Adam, I understand that you and Richard didn't know each other before this project. How did you first meet?
Well, I can remember the exact moment. I was taking a daily stroll, the stroll that I took to Vinegar Hill. And I checked my messages, and there was this message on Instagram from a Richard Sears, whom I wasn't familiar with at the time, proposing to create this podcast and saying that he'd be happy to do this as a labor of love because he was interested in these ideas and also interested in distinguishing himself as a producer as well as a musician. And I was enchanted by the idea. And then, of course, we subsequently met and really connected. The reason that this idea was so welcome to me is that I had been thinking about the possibilities of the podcast as another vehicle of self-expression much more intensely ever since the pandemic began. I had done podcasts for the London Review of Books with Wallace Shawn and Olivier Roy and others, but I hadn't really thought about it as a side gig. When the pandemic struck, I started listening to a variety of podcasts, both American podcasts and French ones. And I was using the French podcasts originally just to keep my French in good order, but then discovered that there were these extraordinary series. One of them was called L'Heure Bleue, the Blue Hour, and the host is an author and an intellectual and impresario named Laure Adler. Her podcast is a series of conversations with people in the arts, politics, intellectual life, music. They're wide-ranging. She's a very idiosyncratic interviewer. She can be quite confrontational. She has a very forceful and zesty personality. She has that kind of female machismo that I associate with a certain kind of woman intellectual in France. And I was totally taken by this show. It seemed a much more daring answer in France to what Terry Gross has been doing for years on Fresh Air. I thought, wow, that seems like a lot of fun. I'd like to explore that. This might be a chance to explore a full range of my interests, even cooking, which is why we invited Claudio Rodin, who is the kind of eminence grise of Middle Eastern food, to be on the program. And so, to make a long story short, when Richard reached out to me, I thought this could really amount to something quite exciting.
Adam, you and I met when what is sometimes called the journalism of ideas had a more significant role in the magazine world. Publications like Lingua Franca provided a forum for talking about ideas in a way that was at once serious and entertaining. As I've gotten more interested in podcasting, I've long felt that there was an opportunity for audio projects in a similar spirit.
Frankly, the interview as theater of combat is so much a part of our era's ethos, it doesn't really appeal to me very much. I'm a bit tired of it. The purpose is not to put forward flattering portraits of these individuals, although I admire the people I invited on the show. And there are certainly moments of friction and tension. George Lewis and I, for example, have a somewhat tense conversation about when Coltrane entered his truly sublime phase. These are chances to reflect on ideas together in a spirit of kind of mutual inquiry, mutual exploration.
Richard, of course, is a musician, and you, Adam, have written a lot about music. 4 of the people you talk to are musicians. Was that a deliberate choice?
The podcast has a musical dimension. Richard was pointing out that as he produced these episodes, he became deeply familiar with the speech patterns of every person we interviewed. We were talking earlier about how Janacek, the great Czech composer, had done research on what he called speech melodies. And in fact, he based some of his compositions on speech melodies. Many years later, Steve Reich did the same thing with his great composition, Different Trains. So, you're hearing a certain kind of music from the speech melody of each person we chose to interview, and you're hearing it in the counterpoint of our voices.
Well, music is a good metaphor for the kinds of conversations you have. To play together, play well together, musicians have to have mutual respect and treat each other with generosity. And that seems to be the animating spirit of these conversations, even though they touch on many of today's so-called hot-button issues.
I do see it as a kind of an opportunity to get beyond the bile and vindictiveness and shaming that unfortunately have become so much a part of our discourse. We talk about some of the issues that have become hot button questions, for example, cultural appropriation. But the purpose really is to reflect on what appropriation actually means, not on cultural appropriation as some kind of litmus test. For example, Ardo Lindsay talks at some point about whether a certain kind of music that is very introspective and first person and soul-bearing, whether that will historically be seen as a white form or white European form of expression. We hold to it so tightly. It seems to be so important to us. It's important to me. But maybe at some point in time, we will view it as a historically specific mode of expression. So I don't know that Ardo even believes that, but he's taking certain chances. And I think this is if you will, and I'm joking here, a safe space to talk about ideas that are challenging. It's intimacy and it's trust. And it's the willing to take chances in conversation, knowing that the person on the other side is not there to judge you.
Were there any moments or revelations that surprised you during these conversations? Some of the people you spoke to, like Vivian Gornick, are quite well known and have written extensively about themselves. But I find that audio sometimes encourages people to explore their lives more freely than they might on the page.
I sense that Vivian spoke in a very audacious way about her childhood and about her discovery of sexuality. She talks about these things, of course, in her wonderful memoir, Fierce Attachments. But there's something even more immediate and almost surprised with herself about the way she discusses it on this program. In the episode with Vivian, she talks about a question that has run through all of her work, which is this struggle between love and work. And it grows out of the struggle that she had with her mother, who, was this fierce believer in love and in love as a woman's salvation in life. And Vivian made a different choice. And I think she speaks very powerfully, very affectingly about the choice that she made, while also acknowledging the pain and loss that it's caused her. I was also struck by how open Margot Jefferson was about her dealings with melancholy and solitude. Margot's a brilliant critic of the arts, and I have great admiration for her memoir, Negroland. But one of the things that's striking about the memoir is how understated and elusive it is. It's a wonderful self-portrait that's also not very self-revealing. It's very controlled. I think she spoke in a way that was much more open and introspective than I had expected.
Adam, do you find you listen to a lot of podcasts these days, now that you are a podcaster? And if so, do you have any favorites?
I do listen to some. I've been listening lately to Robin Kelly's podcast about Errol Garner, great self-taught pianist who's best known for Concert by the Sea. And Robin devotes each episode to a moment in Errol Garner's career, a specific album, and invites a guest, usually a really brilliant jazz musician, to talk about Garner and about the impact of that particular record. And I think it's a beautiful podcast.
I enjoy listening to Errol Garner, but I just don't think of him as the subject of popular interest in the way that pianist composers like, say, Thelonious Monk are.
It's a somewhat esoteric and iconoclastic choice because Garner, although he was a very popular pianist in his day, I mean, every middle-class family had a copy of Concert by the Sea. Garner, was not Monk, was not Herbie Hancock, was not Bill Evans. He was someone who was considered a brilliant oddity, and by some even a kind of cocktail pianist. So he's taken this musician who has not always been really richly appreciated and places him at the very center of the Black music tradition in America, and shows that, in fact, he's a musician whom a lot of musicians care about. You bring in a bit of history, but at the same time, you show how this history resonates in the present. What makes it alive to you right now? And I mean, that's what Kelly does with Garner. You don't have to know every detail of Garner's life to see why this music feels so alive to musicians who are making music in the present.
I like it when smart people are able to think both about the life and work without reducing their analysis to either one. I, for one, am as interested in the creator as what he or she creates.
I agree. I think that's what this forum can do. The interviews that we've done in Myself with Others are biographical in nature, and they essentially document how the people we've interviewed have become the people we know. But they're also explorations of how they're engaging with concerns about culture and politics and ideas that a lot of us are thinking about.
The conversations you had for Myself with Others were with very different kinds of musicians, novelists, and critics. Were there any through lines that emerged from them?
Another thing that was really enjoyable about doing these conversations, which I didn't predict, were the echoes of earlier conversations in each episode. For example, Coltrane comes up in a number of episodes. George Lewis said to me, I think a lot more about Coltrane than I do about John Cage. And he talks about Coltrane's sound late in his career, when his sound kind of floats above the music and his vibrato almost resembles some of the music you hear in Korea. And then Marilyn Crispell, who's a wonderful avant-garde pianist, told me about the epiphany that she had when she was a classical musician in her 20s, and she heard A Love Supreme for the first time. And she felt as if Coltrane were in the room with her when she heard it. And she decided from that evening on that she was going to give up classical music and become a jazz musician. It was really just on the strength of this listening to A Love Supreme. So these moments, I think, give the show a kind of secret cohesion. In a way, they feel like chapters of the same project.
What's also notable about these conversations is that there are no pegs. Nobody's selling a new book or movie or album, and that's pretty rare in the world of cultural journalism.
Exactly. Well, that was another thing that we decided to do. These conversations would not be about a specific product that's in the market right now. They would be about people whose work I find arresting for some reason. And it would be an occasion to really do a deep dive into what makes them who they are.
Richard, in addition to working with Adam on Myself with Others, you're engaged in a long project about the drummer Albert Tootie Heath.
Albert Tootie Heath has been a big fixture in, I think, the last 10 years of my creative life. He is an incredible jazz drummer, and he's performed on landmark jazz recordings. He's someone I met as a teenager attending the Stanford Jazz Workshop. When I moved to this house in Altadena with a few friends of mine, I learned that just like a couple blocks away, Albert Tootie Heath was living, and he had been living there for 40 years. So I made a point of just seeking him out, and I would take him out for lunch. And with the help of a friend of mine, Max Wrightson, and the Los Angeles Jazz Society, I succeeded in putting together a suite of music for him. We performed that for a couple of years, made a recording. And when I moved to New York, I knew he was going to be playing in town. And I called him up and I was like, Tootie, why don't you spend an extra day here and do a masterclass at the Owl Music Parlor, and you can tell some stories to a bunch of people who don't know you. This is kind of a fragile moment in jazz history where we're lucky that people like this are still alive. A couple of weeks after that, his brother Jimmy passed away, and I was kind of taken over with this feeling that it became extremely urgent for me to document all these stories of Tootie's.
Thank you both for talking with me about your project.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert.
This podcast was brought to you by the New York Institute for the Humanities. You can find us on Stitcher, iTunes, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. For more information, visit us at NYI Humanities.